Hello and welcome to the Racial Equity webinar series. I'm Kinney Banerjee, the Senior Manager of Coalitions Relations at USBC, and I'm so USBC's efforts to create and model a culture of inclusion, diversity, and equity. This is part of our strategic framework goal. And it's focused on building capacity of the breastfeeding field to apply not just the breastfeeding lens to inform and guide our strategies and activities, but also an equity mirror so that we may examine our own internal structures, cultures, and policies. And this series is possible due to the funding support from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. The USBC website houses more than 20 online learning communities on breastfeeding-related topic areas from the Surgeon General's call to action and beyond. And these learning communities are open to all site users. So please, join these learning communities, explore the ones of greatest interest to you. And we have a whole bunch of resources to offer you through this. So through this series, we have the Racial Equity series has a webinar on every other month, odd-numbered months, and then we also have blog posts, a file library, and sometimes our conversations very often after a webinar continues on the forum as well. That we have. So we hope that you will join the Racial Equity learning community and start engaging with your peers on conversation. Get to our page. If you go to our website, www.usbreastfeeding.org, and go to News and Info, click on that and it'll open up all the different learning. You'll see a tab, scroll down and click on a tab called Learning Communities. And as you scroll down all the different learning communities, you'll see the one on Racial Equity learning community. So we've had, as I said, this is a series, and we started in September. Our first webinar was presented by the Center for Social Inclusion on their report, The Removing Barriers to Breastfeeding. And our second was about how do you apply the analysis of that report into the work that we do. We've also had moms' voices from across the spectrum, from across our country in January. And then last time we had Sherry Payne present a really powerful webinar on building cultural safety into lactation care. So all of these sessions are archived, and even if you can't attend live, you can go and click on the website and access the recording and all of the handouts. So for today's session, our presentation is divided into two segments or parts, and we'll pause at the end of each segment to review any questions you have, comments, or any discussion things. And so please submit your questions during the presentation as you hear things and as they come up for you, and I will make sure that I ask them of our presenter. And today we'll also, as the presentation starts, float a couple of questions. So look for them in your chat box. You'll see a couple of questions that come on soon after the presentation starts, and we want you to listen to the session today through the lens of those questions as well. So please, we want to have as much interaction as possible during this session. And here's how you type your questions. So on the right side of your screen, you should see a control panel. If you don't see it, it might be minimized. So click on that orange tab with the arrow and it'll pop back out. So go down, scroll down, and you just below the audio tab is a blue tab which says questions. Click on that tab and it'll open up a text box for you to type your questions in. And then during this session, if you have audio problems or any other technical issues, please email office@usbreastfeeding.org, and one of us staff will be able to help you. And that brings me to today's topic, societal equity, a fresh look at creating effective strategies. So this session introduces strategies that individuals and organizations can use to better inform their thinking about societal problems, including equity and inequity. The strategies consider varied and often omitted factors such as the influences of context, culture, point of viewing, resistance, history, power, and many other significant variables. Creating and accessing a relevant and better some of these strategies increases our overall quality of conceptualizing, decision-making, and implementation towards the advancement of our work in social justice and equity. So I am delighted to introduce our presenter for this session, Pauline E. Brooks. Dr. Brooks is the owner of Pauline E. Brooks Consulting. It's a small research and evaluation company in Los Angeles. She has particular interest in cross-cultural issues, bridging cultures, and the elimination of racism and other inequities. Pauline is a former manager of evaluation, large California-based health foundation, a university professor, independent evaluator for family foundations, and a contractor with many foundations and community-based organizations. She has worked internationally within the US and internationally, and worked with many different ethnic and minority communities. She's also traveled to Ethiopia, South Africa, Kenya, Suriname. Her initial training and evaluation work was at the UCLA Center for the Study of Evaluation, where she completed her doctoral degree. She is also a Master Pauline, a student of Master Z. Pauline has been teaching Tai Chi and Qigong for 15 years. She teaches and has recently finished a book on the applications of Tai Chi and Qigong to everyday life, de-stressing, centering, letting go of rigidity and stiffness, and cultivating suppleness and fluidity. Pauline brings us a wealth of insights, wisdom, and pure research based on this. And we are so honored to have Pauline share with the US community on a topic that is so vital to us as we work together to identify and tackle structural racism in our field. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pauline.
Greetings, everyone. I'm happy to have this opportunity to share with you several strategies for thinking about societal problems. These can help with planning, implementing, and evaluating programs and policies. These strategies can potentially generate information that increases the knowledge base about the topic or issue that you may be addressing. These strategies support informed decision-making. The strategies provide a means for answering the question, what is it that I may need to know in order to address this particular societal problem? And for today's discussion, the problem topic will be equity. This presentation is separated into two parts, as Kinney mentioned, with opportunity for discussion after each part. Part 1 is entitled, Looking Outside and Beyond the Usual. This means expand beyond your usual places and ways of seeking information and ideas. For instance, if you are in medicine, spend some time in sociology, or in psychology, or law, ethnic and cultural studies, or the like, learning about the societal problem that you're addressing. Talk with and listen to people with firsthand knowledge of the problem. In this case, people who are victims and suffer the harm of inequitable treatment and outcomes. Part 2 of today's session will deal with an interdisciplinary model called 5-path analysis. This cross-cultural interdisciplinary model works in 5 areas for the purpose of better understanding a particular societal problem, or for planning, or for implementing programs, or for policies, or for studying a particular issue, or doing evaluation of a particular issue, as in this case, equity. As I mentioned, equity will be the general focus of this presentation, but virtually any societal problem may benefit from the use of strategies and ideas that I will be talking about here today. Part 1. People have worked towards racial equity, racial, class, and gender justice, and the like for hundreds of years in the United States. Such efforts may not be well known among the general public, but they are not new. What can be new, however, is that at any point there is always the opportunity to look for new strategies for better understanding these kinds of societal problems and looking for potential pathways towards solutions. So please consider the following as opportunities for bringing relevant and perhaps some new ideas into the mainstream knowledge base about equity. Strategy 1. This strategy borrows an observation from philosophy and linguistics. It is that equity has a partner, namely inequity. Equity and inequity are connected, inextricably linked. In essence, they are two sides of the same coin, like up and down, right and left, above and below. One side of the coin does not exist without the existence of the other side. Each side in some way gives reference to, it implies, it indicates that the other side is there, the presence of the other side. One side, the other side. Thinking of equity in this way provides clues that can expand our equity work from just, quote, building and supporting equity, which we commonly hear in contemporary mainstream discussion. But also it shows us three other kinds of equity supporting tasks that we should pay attention to, as shown in slide 3. In this slide, notice that in addition to building and supporting equity, which is category A, there are also three other kinds of circumstances upon which we can and should focus our attention, namely efforts within categories B, C, and D. We can also look for and give efforts towards dismantling things that serve to erode, block, or interfere with equity, that's in category B, interrupt things in the environment that serve to prop up, support, or depend on the existence of inequity. For example, what in the present day environment depends on things remaining the way they are? And in category D, supporting actions and things that serve to dismantle or dissolve inequity. All four categories of things can be important in looking at the issue of equity. Hence, our mainstream discussions on equity can be expanded to include thinking, problem-solving identification, data gathering, and proposed solutions in each of these other three areas. The strongest effort in this kind of case would be to try to address all four aspects or categories when working on equity or inequity in society. Strategy 2, this one borrows from physics. It has to do with the point from which one views. I will call this positionality. Imagine you are in a room standing and giving a talk in front of a group of people. From your physical position, facing the group of people seated in front of you, about 10 feet away from you, what is it possible for you to see? For instance, if no one changes position, you can see faces of the audience, the various kinds of shoes of people sitting in the front row, who is wearing glasses, whether they are wearing a button-down shirt or have a tie, a bow tie, or have a design on the front of their sweater. Including your peripheral vision, which does not give clear detail, you can roughly see 180 degrees. You will be able to identify, describe, consider, and analyze that which you can see. Contrary to what you've always told your kids, you do not have eyes in the back of your head. Again, if no one changes position, you cannot see what is behind you. You cannot see what is on the walls, what the furniture is behind you, or if a monster is creeping up behind you. Also, from your position, you cannot see whether someone in the audience is wearing a bright yellow bow at the back of their hair, or that someone has a tag hanging out at the back of the collar. You cannot see what audience members look like as a group from behind. Hence, you will not be able to identify, describe, consider, and analyze that which you cannot see. I would encourage you to play with this at some time. Act it out. What can you actually see? What can you not see? Now, a variation on this. Place an object on a table between you and your audience. This object has a different design on its different sides. Perhaps there is a poem that is written around the entire object. Different paintings on different sides, different designs of some sort. Again, if no one changes position, the painting and part of the poem, or whatever that you see from your position, is not what the audience sees. You can employ every technology, microscopes, telescopes, binoculars, night vision, magnifying glass, computer analysis. But by not changing some position, yours or that of the object, you will not be able to see what the audience sees. Think about it. For instance, you can also not see your own face. To see what the audience sees, you leave your position and walk around and join the audience and look in the same direction that the audience is looking. Or perhaps you have someone rotate the object, or you place a mirror in the audience so that you can see what they see, but this still is some kind of movement. Or you have the audience describe for you what they see. In parallel fashion, it is also important for the audience to see, learn about, and understand what you see from your own original position. Now, imagine that the object is some sort of societal problem, like some kind of societal inequity. If you wish to know as much as possible about this object societal problem and increase your understanding of this object societal problem, you will want to have the greatest amount of quality information. Part of doing so, you will need to change your position, thereby changing your points for viewing. You will want a 360-degree viewing and understanding of the object societal position. You will not want to limit yourself to what is at best a 180-degree point of view. In practice, in the case of equity, inequity, this means taking approaches and actions like actually going into and spending substantial time and effort within communities that have experienced and have been disadvantaged by the inequity. In terms of resources, dialogue, data gathering, listening and taking notes, becoming informed and educated from the viewpoints of persons in these communities. In practice, in the case of equity, inequity, this means taking approaches and actions like listening to people from these communities, realizing, acknowledging, and including that their concerns, priorities, their understandings, their concepts, their attributions concerning root causes of equity, inequity, their ways of operating, their direct experiences with the problem of equity, inequity, their assumptions, language, and analyses of their experience of the problem will likely be very different from what you know and experience from your position relative to this problem. In this example, then, important questions for you to consider in the work that you do: how and to what extent have you included a quality 360-degree knowledge base throughout all aspects of the work and problem solving that you are attempting to do on this particular problem of equity, inequity. Strategy 3 concerns context. Context gives meaning to things. Everything happens in a context. Yet in research, evaluation, in planning programs, policies, we often fail to even think about context. So picture yourself walking on a sidewalk on a beautiful sunny day. Feel how your shoes gently touch the sidewalk as you leisurely stroll. Now, picture the exact same movements of walking, but now you are in deep water. Next, picture these exact same movements of walking, but now a crane has come by and hoisted you into the air. Walking, swimming, flying, or waving your arms and legs in the air, the only thing that changed in these three scenarios was context. It was the sidewalk, it was the water, it was the air. The behavior was the same. From this example, it is important to ask, how well am I providing quality, description, and understanding of the relevant and influential contextual factors in order to make accurate interpretations and valid conclusions about equity, inequity that I'm addressing? To take another look at context, culture can be considered a part of context. Different cultures may have and use different concepts and interpretations. Many of you are aware that indigenous cultures in the Arctic, for example, may have many dozens of words to describe snow and ice. Similarly, many cultures that live in the desert or on islands in the ocean will have concepts and ways of identifying their respective environments, and probably will not have the same number and demarcations as the indigenous cultures in the Arctic that they use for describing ice and snow. The contexts are very different in each of those scenarios. Simply, the same thing may have different cultural meanings to different cultures. Also, the same thing may have different historical meanings to different cultures. And that's important when we're thinking of racial equity and inequity. To give an example, correcting for, quote, grammatical errors in the transcriptions of audio-taped interviews of pregnant African American women, research office staff, and these staff members were from a culture different from the women that had been interviewed. So research office staff on a university research project inadvertently changed the meaning of what the women had said. This misrepresentation was caught only because the ethnographers had been drawn from the local African American communities and had been included in the processes of writing reports and were in a position to spot the misrepresentation. Without those ethnographers being included throughout all aspects of the project, these types of errors would have continued and become integrated into the research literature. Also, this project gave time and attention to building openness and trust across the different cultural groups that comprise the research team. This is something that commonly is not done. But doing this made it easier for the ethnographers and the evaluators to bring forward their concerns about this and other validity, accuracy, and other quality-related issues concerning the research. I'll give you an example in terms of community realities. Again, on the same project, the presence of these community ethnographers, the ones coming from these communities that were being studied, also made it possible to correct for uninformed conclusions made on the part of the researchers. To give an example of one instance, the pregnant African American women reported a high incidence of eating fruits and vegetables. This was a good finding, and one that was in stark contrast to a common hypothesis among researchers and others in the mainstream that low birth weight among African Americans was at least in part the result of African American women not eating fruits and vegetables. In this hypothesis from the mainstream, the responsibility for the problem was situated with the African American women. They were not eating fruits and vegetables. The community ethnographers clarified, however, in these two African American communities, fresh fruits, and I will underscore fresh fruits and vegetables, were virtually non-existent. They were the leftovers from stores in white and wealthy neighborhoods, and usually of very poor and undesirable quality. Hence, pregnant women in these two communities had to resort to canned fruits and vegetables, some of which were also old, perhaps even expired. These canned fruits and vegetables often had high amounts of salt, sugar, all varieties of preservatives, artificial flavoring, artificial coloring, and the like. Context, then, was important. Mainstream assumptions, fashioning of the actual questions that were asked, and the interpretations of findings did not accurately apply to the realities of these two African American communities in a large metropolitan area. In practice, to improve the overall quality, accurateness, and completeness of your work on equity, inequity, the strongest position is to do things like incorporate people from the different cultural communities affected, hire them, for example, as data collectors, as cultural interpreters, as people who help or co-construct instruments, co-construct papers, presentations, and policies. Taking such steps toward change will also require changing from business and budgets as usual. It means, for example, adding community people to the budget, as well as allocating time and resources for their training, listening to them as equals, recognizing them as experts on parts of their communities and on their own lived experiences relative to equity and inequity. Some not commonly considered questions to consider for your work, then: who is telling and who is informing you about what things mean around equity and inequity? In everyday practice, What is the openness and trust across the different cultural racial groups that are involved, either within your organization or between your organization and these communities? It is important to note that institutions and organizations have cultures too. Referring to the same research project, several institutional aspects of culture had to be addressed and had to be eventually changed. Some of the university and or funder cultural ways that were eventually addressed and changed included adding an active, participating, powerful community advisory board drawn from members of these two communities. The Community Advisory Board insisted from the beginning that the funder hire people from the community, and to do so at the same dollar rate as the university's graduate research assistants, which is almost never done, to be trained alongside the graduate research students to do the ethnographic data collection and to participate throughout all aspects of the research process. This was an influence on decision-making that the community had. Data that were de-identified, the Community Advisory Board argued, need to remain in the community and to be accessible to the community for future research, and not be shipped off to the funder at the end of the research project. This brought resources into the community. The Community Advisory Board members were to participate in reviewing all reports and have opportunity and adequate time to edit and or add to reports before any reports were to be sent to the funder. This change required changing timelines and influenced whose voices would be heard in these reports. The funder was to specifically name the communities as stakeholders in their RFPs and RFQs, as well as in what was to be expected from the outcomes of the research study. There needed to be some meaningful community-oriented aspects to be studied as defined from the viewpoints of the communities. This turned out to be another form of inclusion. Project decisions and resources were to be shared between the grantee and the Community Advisory Board. Again, these were movements towards equity. The Community Advisory Board was also to have direct access to the funder and not just to the local grantee. So the model looked more like that of three equal partners: funder, grantee, and Community Advisory Board, as opposed to the usual hierarchy of funder over grantee and grantee over community. And in that last model, when grantee are over community, the community is virtually powerless most commonly. So this kind of change was also an effort towards equity. The program officer from the funder participated in regularly scheduled monthly project-wide meetings. These meetings were held in the communities. Holding these meetings, regularly scheduled, inside these communities was part of the community's attempts to educate both the funder and the grantee, the university, about the reality of life in these communities. In this instance, knowledge and learning was to be bidirectional. The community had something to teach. The university and the funder had something to teach. Knowledge went both ways. At this point, Kinney, do we have any questions or comments or anything coming in?
Thank you, Pauline. We do, at this time, We don't have any questions yet, but I just wanted to remind our audience participants that as you think about what Pauline is saying, thoughts, comments, and especially from what you, as you listen to it from the lens of the questions that have been floated in the chat box, please do send it to us. So I don't see any questions now, Pauline, so I guess we can continue.
Okay. Part 2, 5 paths analysis. As part of preparation for seeing more clearly such societally charged issues as race, racial inequity, and racism, for instance, it helps to first work with issues you literally know nothing about and to which you have not been socialized. For example, pick a societal issue from another country or from your own country, but about which you have no information, no knowledge, no opinions, no socialization to. The question now becomes, to gain a good understanding of this issue that I've picked, that I've selected to learn about, what would I need to do? From the words and points of views of the various groups involved and from research conducted within the different academic fields, you would probably want to find out about things like the nature of the issue. What is it? Are there some definitions that I need to know? You'd also want to know something of the history. Where did this particular issue that I know nothing about, where did it come from? How did it start? How did it develop? Who was involved? How were they involved? And with what outcome? You'd want to know something about the background of the people. Who are these people? What is their culture? What are their beliefs? Their values? How do they know things? What are their ways of knowing? What's culturally appropriate in terms of how they relate to other people? You'd want to know what are the various contexts in which this particular issue has existed and continues to exist. What are the relationships, historical and present day, of these people with other groups? Who makes the decisions concerning this issue? Who controls the resources, the information, and the flow of information? And by what mechanisms and processes? And who participates in the construction of resources and the flow of information? What are the goals of the groups involved? What are the different viewpoints of the involved groups? These are some of the kinds of questions that you would be asking. Now, in terms of these kinds of questions, I think I need a minute just for something got a little bit confused.
Sure, take a pause.
Do we have any question that's come in yet? Kinney?
Not yet. I don't see any questions yet.
Okay, then
But take a pause if you need to. Sure.
I need a pause, please.
Sure.
Okay, are we on?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry for the pause. I accidentally dropped something. But those are the kinds of questions that you would be asking. And what's the probability that those are the kinds of questions that we begin to apply to the issue of equity and inequity. So think of what you would normally be doing in looking at those questions, and then why are we or are we not doing something similar to looking at issues of equity and inequity. So in this vein of openly exploring a societal issue, this kind of approach seems also appropriate for acquiring a strong, more objective, and dispassionate understanding of topics of race, racial equity, and racism. Approaching topics like this in this manner is even more important given the deeply entrenched and omnipresent racismization that has been part of Western societies, and the US especially, for hundreds of years. So 5 paths analysis, which I will now discuss in this last part of my talk, provides some guidance and organization in considering many of those more open kinds of questions that were just asked. So 5 paths analysis involves 5 areas: history, laterality, accumulation, resistance, and power. Knowledge from these 5 areas can be used by people in their development of program and policy. It can be used by researchers in terms of what aspects to look at. It can be used by activists, legislators, evaluators, social science practitioners. It has broad application for many different aspects of looking at issues. 5 paths analysis collects and analyzes data from these 5 different yet overlapping areas. The idea is that racial inequities, equities, do not exist in isolation, but are in some way connected to a local, regional, or national history. They are in some way connected to the presence of other factors and circumstances that surround, support, or rely upon the existence of the issue and circumstances, and that's laterality. The building up of processes, events, or outcomes that have accrued over time, that's accumulation. Various types and strengths of refusal to change that support the status quo or work to oppose changes to the existing situation. That's resistance. And the last one is decision-making that is associated with the group's perspectives and interests, dynamics and structures of power that are represented and upheld in the issue or circumstance that you're looking at. That's power. Each of these 5 paths generates data from different yet significant angles. This variety of information, in turn, enriches your understanding of the issue. Combined, these 5 paths of data construct a more holistic picture of equities, inequities. They provide a broad, well-informed base of knowledge from which to generate programs, policies, research, evaluation to more effectively address, in this case, racial inequity, equity. So starting with the first one, history. What is the history? Let me begin with an example of 400 years of specialized bread making in a particular society. This society specializes in certain kinds of breads, and it's done so for more than 400 years. And in so doing, and it's an important part of how this society developed, out of this, there was an entire sets of industries for baking bread. There were industries that involved developing and manufacturing, designing and manufacturing the equipment and the metal pans for the bread. There were factories and everything that went into building factories, the materials to build the buildings in which bread is made. There had to be large swaths of land in order to grow the grain in order that went into the bread making. There needed to be lots of seed, lots of water to plant, to grow these plants. There had to be laborers, doctors, lawyers, cooks, bakers. There had to be restaurants that served this. There needed to be entertainment to entertain all the different people that were involved in this bread making. There needed to be transportation, laws, authorities, property rights, labor rights. All this sprang up out of these 400 years of bread making. And when you think of this, and if you put yourself on a timeline, let's say 400 years into this, you come along and you say, well, bread is great and we're the best and we built an entire society pretty much based on bread making, but we also need vegetables. And you start beginning to look into how can we carve out this niche or influence this bread making culture with all of its structure, all of its institutions, all of its systems, all of its culture and ways and understanding and history, to begin to include this other notion about vegetables as an important element in diet, and that it needs to participate in all of these other different areas. What's the probability that you're going to make a great deal of headway without understanding that this bread-making culture has been in existence for 400 years? If you imagine that this bread-making culture is only 2 years old or 3 years old when you first became aware of it, then you're sorely mistaken. And at the same time, you are underestimating the entire weight of those 400 years in which bread-making culture systems has seeped into the very nature of the society in which you are. Now, if we take this notion of the bread making and switch it over to the issue of racial inequity, we begin to see that there is a lot of weight from this history. For example, across all sectors of U.S. society, there are many hundreds of years of race-related laws, strategies, assumptions, rationales, infuse false narratives and inaccurate information, hypotheses, race-related beliefs, ways of behaving, race-related justifications, denial, omissions, and commissions, racial segregation. All of these, in those early hundreds of years, were intentionally designed to create racial inequities. U.S. society, as we know it today, has in part been built on this history, how it has been generally avoided in the mainstream and left to evolve for hundreds of years, and the historic multifaceted continuous struggles largely by communities of color, but not all, to change these racially oppressive practices, I would estimate comprises maybe 9/10 of the racial equity circumstances in the U.S. today. The point is, this history exists in the present. Some of the questions become then, what are you studying in this history? How are you actually applying it to your understanding of root causes of present-day racial inequity or equity? How is what you are studying reflected in the racial equity inequity work that you and or your organization is doing? Basic questions for this history path include, what are some of the historical elements that have contributed to the racial inequity that you're working on? So what are some of the historical elements that are contributing to breastfeeding? How do these historical elements relate to one another? How does slavery, for example, relate to issues around breastfeeding in African American communities? What are the key conditions that need to be changed in order to effectively eliminate the racial inequities that you're seeing? Concretely and practically, how can you and others implement these kinds of changes that you identify as being needed? Throughout the search of the historical path, explorers of knowledge are looking for inequities in how people were treated, inequities in the processes of the society, as well as inequities in outcome. The second area under 5 paths analysis is laterality. What things in the society depend on the existence of racial inequity? What supports it? Imagine that there's a hotel built out in the middle of nowhere. This hotel is a fine hotel. People like to go there. It has nice soft beds. It has really good service. It has many things that people find attractive, and people come by the droves. Some of the things it does not have has to do with restaurants. It has a little tiny itty bitty restaurants, not very good. There's no gift shop, so there's no place to go get your toothpaste. There's no flower shop. There's no good coffee shop. They don't arrange for people to get their ride out much further out into the forest to go on excursions and things like that. If this hotel is doing so well, eventually all those services will spring up around it. The hotel doesn't offer it, but it creates an opportunity for all those other services to spring up around it. Those services become invested in the well-being of that hotel. And in that, if something were to happen with the hotel, these services would feel like something is happening to them. And in response, they may show up and try to do something to help the hotel fix the problem so that their own business will continue to do well. So not only do situations have connections to the past, as in the history path that was just mentioned prior, situations are also connected to, and sometimes really deeply anchored in, contemporary surroundings. So along the pathway of laterality, one explores relevant circumstances and situations that surround, support, nurture, connect to, and or rely upon the existence of the societal issue or circumstance under investigation. Laterality further reinforces the idea that present-day situations of racial inequity, for instance, do not exist in isolation or as independent random fragments of events, but rather exist within a webbing or surrounding context of other related circumstances. one critical question becomes, what, if anything, in the nature of the surrounding environment is supporting or relying upon the existence of racial inequity? That's a kind of question that is rarely, if ever, asked. The concept of laterality may be likened to either a bicycle wheel or to a spider's web. In the analogy of the bicycle wheel, the racial circumstance under investigation sits at the wheel's hub, the spokes of the wheel tied to the hub. The hub and spokes work together as one. When planning your data collection for the laterality path, key questions may include, what in the surroundings is presently helping to create and or sustain the observed racial inequity? Or on the other side of this, the other coin of this, what function, if any, does the existence of this racially inequitable outcome serve relative to other circumstances in the environment? In looking at laterality, here you are exploring the influence of systems, institutions, resources, politics, or any number of other things that surround the racial inequity you are trying to address. The third area under 5-path analysis is accumulation. And what you're looking at are questions around what advantages, benefits, privileges versus disadvantages, disbenefits, disprivileges have been accumulated as a result of the societal issue, i.e., as a result of inequity. By what methods and mechanisms has this accumulation taken place? And this accumulation could include things like power, decision-making authority, assets, money, education, employment opportunities, and the like. What are the cumulative impacts of racial inequities? Over time, what do differences in the accumulation of advantages and disadvantages mean for different racial groups? Imagine you are watching two trains, and there are researchers that write about this. Brown et al. In 2003 is one of them. But imagine you are watching two trains. One train has the green light and is moving forward at a good speed. There are no side tracks, no red lights, just moving along unimpeded. The second train is going to the same destination as the first, but has lots of red lights, many side tracks, and instructions from the main office to go back to the station and wait, and then start again much later, as well as move at a slower speed and still encounter the same kinds of obstacles. Or, in another circumstance, one train has the green light and is moving forward at a good speed. The second train is actually sent backwards. When it is permitted to move forward, it is instructed to go slower than the first train. This second train will have to go a long way to even get to the spot from where the first train started. In both examples of the trains, the distance separating the first train and the second train continues to grow. Sounds like one of those math problems we used to get in high school. The mechanisms that have been put into place and that control how the two trains are to proceed create the circumstances where the second train can in no way catch up to, let alone surpass or even compete with the first train on any kind of equal footing. In these two examples, there are all kinds of accumulations of advantages and accumulations of disadvantages. There are disaccumulations. There are accumulations of punishments. There are accumulations of all kinds of positives, and there are accumulations of all kinds of negatives. Some of the basic questions to the accumulation path are: what are the various ways, if any, that inequities have been built upon or accrued over time for the populations that you are working with? Using the model of a dyad, that one group's disadvantages are linked to another group's advantages, what are the specific accumulations and disaccumulations for the groups that are linked? In what way, if at all, are any advantages and disadvantages in the circumstance associated with the historical or the lateral area of the five-pass analysis? What are the key conditions that need to be changed in order to effectively eliminate this particular racial inequity, with a focus on looking at those things that surround it, that rely upon it, depend upon it, and that the inequity itself feeds? The fourth area under five-pass analysis is resistance. One of many ways to measure racism and racial inequity is to measure resistance to its removal. Resistance to the removal of racism or racial inequities includes things that can be done consciously or unconsciously, or as one researcher describes, disconsciously, where you hold both two things together at the same time, but you figure out a way of holding both ideas that contradict each other and still continue to move in life. Resistance can be unintentional as well as intentional. Resistance may result in failure to do something, such as failure to reduce or eliminate, or in some other way move away from racism or racial inequities. It may also take the form of failure to affirmatively pursue non-racism or to push aside racism. Resistance has many manifestations. It need not take the form of hard force or blatant actions, but historically, these two have been part of the methods of resistance to the removal of racial inequities. The history shows there's a great deal of violence that has taken place over those hundreds of years. It was resistance to changing a system that racially treated people inequitably. Resistance may manifest in ways that are not that hard and violent. It may show up in ways that are soft, subtle, sophisticated, or civilized. But the bottom line is, all of these things serve to maintain the racial hierarchy. Resistance can show up as one clear-cut decision: no, we will not do that. Or it may appear in continuous, unrelenting waves, or perhaps in the form of layers of obstacles. One obstacle right after the other, just like our train on the train track. It got a lot of red lights, that was being sidetracked, that was being told to go back, start again, was being told to go slower. Resistance may be overt. You can actually see it and you say, it can be covert, not seen, not in the public eye, or attributed to, well, that's just how things are in the society, that's just how life is. I am not resisting, I am just being realistic. By maintaining the racial hierarchy and racial inequity, everyday actions and behavior of individuals, institutions, and systems, intentionally and unintentionally, may serve to block the removal of the racial inequity, thereby hindering society from advancing in the direction of non-racism or non-racial inequities. Given that resistance can come in so many different forms and is often covert, under the table, or through the back door, it is important to capture and document actual happenings of events around racial equities and inequities. Several possible questions in this area include, if there is a racial hierarchy present, what is it? Name it, define it, describe it. In what ways does it serve to block efforts to change the racial circumstances? From the points of view of those who attempt to make changes and those who attempt to block changes, what are the specifics of what actually happened? What are the key conditions that need to be changed in order to effectively eliminate the observed racial inequity? Concretely and practically, how can these changes be implemented? Looking at racial inequity and the resistance path. Because resistance can take so many forms, investigators may find themselves seeking to measure resistance that appears as overt racism, covert racism, common sense racism. All of these are described in the research literature. There's at least 33 different of these kinds of manifestations of racism written about in the social scientific literature. Begin to look for resistance rooted in conscious and unconscious racialized ideas. Look for resistance in the kinds of assumptions that are being made. Look for resistance in behavior, habits, and even in our conventions of how we just normally do things. That's just how we have always done things. It is important to capture all of this that may be operating in a particular situation. All of this is part of the glue, if not the bulwark, that supports the status quo. And it's the status quo that provides and produces the inequities that we see today. The last area under 5-path analysis is that of power. Many authors in the social science research literature have pointed to the connection between racism, racial inequities, and power. And power can be expressed in any number of ways. Some examples of power listed in an inequity typology are drawn from a paper I presented at the American Evaluation Association in Baltimore in November 2007. The following question was posed as just one of any number of ways that one can begin to think about how equity and inequity can be measured. This is just one of dozens and dozens of ways. The question posed was, compared to European Americans, to what extent are African Americans proportionately involved in the power and authority that drives the health systems in the United States? The options that the respondents were given to respond to was little or no involvement, all the way up to big involvement. It was on a scale from 1 to 5. And the kinds of items under power included the power to identify issues to be addressed, the power to define issues, the power to set goals, to determine who participates and who does not, to actually plan the solutions, the power to make decisions, the power to shape the implementation and enforcement of those decisions, the power to control and implement safety, protections, and preservation of populations and groups, the power to determine whose interests are served and whose are not. Power also includes things like having access, control, or allocating resources, removing obstacles. In our train example, who had the power to remove all the obstacles that were given to train number 2? Determining lawfulness. Is it lawful? And at one time, for hundreds of years, racial inequity, racial segregation, racism, the ownership of other human beings, the taking of lands of indigenous populations, all this was lawful. Who determines those laws? Power also involves owning and or controlling finances or wealth. Power can include controlling the advancements within society. Who's permitted to move forward? Who has to hold back? So, 5-pass analysis, in using this as a means of guiding and sort of influencing the kind of data or information or the kind of focus that you may place on the particular equity, inequity issue that you're looking at. It, again, like some of the other strategies mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, opens up what you might look at and what you might consider. It works against having a very narrow, small, itty-bitty, tiny focus on one little itty-bitty problem and opens this up. What you're after eventually is beginning to look for root causes for the elimination of racial inequities. At this point, I would like to open it in case there's any discussion or comments. Kinney, is there anything that people would like to be asking or commenting about?
Great. Thank you, Pauline. That was phenomenal. And I'm going to move over to, but we do have some comments and questions that I'm going to read to you in a second. So we have questions relating both to the field and internally. So we have a question which says, how do organizations, often before we do things in the field and for the community instead of with the community, how do we, assess some of our own implicit biases? And the 5-point that you said about looking at positionality and how our decision-making process is made, those are really important. Other, you do have an ancillary, a related reading along with this, Pauline. So would you want to tell us a little bit about the reading that you've suggested that participants in this webinar do as well?
Yes. The reading, actually, I gave a lot of examples from that particular research study. And in that study, my team was the evaluation team hired to follow university researchers as they tried to use qualitative and anthropological methods to look at how is it that African American women have low birth weight babies. And this is across all classes, all areas. And so in looking at that, everything needed to be, and the funder, I have to give the funder a great deal of credit for this, as well as the university. Both of those organizations and institutions opened to do something different. And when the community came in and participated, then the whole dynamic changed. And even though this is an older study, and I'm going to go for a moment, there's a lot of rich material in older studies and in older material. As I started at the beginning, a lot of information, a lot of effort over the entire 400, 500 years has been put into, especially by communities of color, to resist and to change the society to become more equitable. That's not common knowledge, and that appears also in the research literature. So I will offer this. This is an older study, but it has a lot of the elements that an organization, a program, a project, an evaluation team, a research team, or somebody interested in policy can begin to consider, things that are commonly not considered, but can begin to consider in looking at the work that they're doing. To go back to what I understood to be part of a question that Kinney had started to ask, history. I would say history is extremely important. All of us can go through our public education or private education. We can go through 5 PhDs and never get any understanding of this history that is so fundamental to what the United States is about. And I'm not just talking about George Washington and the cherry tree, but the history of the dynamics that have helped shape and build this country and how that plays out today. So my first recommendation would be go to your library, go to the university library, go to your public library, go online or whatever, and begin to look at the history of racial inequities, racial disparities, of how different populations coming from different cultures have been treated historically in the United States. There are a lot of lessons and a lot of patterns to that. Just on your own, working on yourself is something that is very important, and that's going to be a lifelong process, because from the moment you were born into a society that had certain structures, certain kinds of institutions, certain kinds of arrangements, certain kinds of ways of putting certain people into certain kinds of locations, in certain kinds of settings. And all of this, even if you never use the word racism or racial inequity, all of this you have been socialized to. You have been racismized without ever knowing it. And that's all of us, and in many different ways. And so that's going to be a continuous process throughout your entire life. Things you can do would be to begin to interact. It's only when you interact with someone who you might consider as different from you that you begin to learn other kinds of things. You may learn that you're not that different, or you may learn that they have a totally different perspective on the same issue that you're looking at. But you wouldn't know that. You can't do that only by yourself. It's in interaction. As organizations that work in communities, does your organization attend community functions? You may expect community people to come to your function, but are you attending their functions? Do they see you on a regular basis? Do you become part of the community? Do you become perceived as an ally or as someone who has resources and is open to sharing? Are you perceived as someone that can come in and they can ask you for things? In your role, do you just follow a very thin line? Or when information comes across your desk that may be pertinent to the community, do you, one, first think of sending some of that information into the community? Two, do you have someone in the community to send it to? Do you have relationships that are being built? Those are some of the first things that I would say.
Thank you, Pauline. And you answered, in this really rich response. You did. There we had questions about, in developing trust with our communities, just acknowledging these 5 different steps: the accumulation, the lateral context, and how do you do that? So, so that was a question about building trust with communities, making sure that when you do community participatory research, or when you're implementing programs in the community, what are some of these many ways in which that we really build trust?
I would love to comment on that one.
Please.
If you think about it, and part of what I presented at the beginning of this presentation is sort of like, when you've had a chance to think about it, you're going to say, that's sort of like common sense. And I want you to use your common sense. If you think about, how do you as a person build trust among your family members, with your neighbors, or with other people in your community? What would you do? Somebody new moves into the community, maybe you take the initiative and take them a little present and say welcome. If you see somebody needs some assistance, maybe you step forward and do that. You invite them. You let them know that you're interested and you would like to come to some of their things if it seems appropriate. You are building relationships. Now, in that, trust is built when there is honesty and truth. And so this can't be fake. It can't be false. It can't be you're trying to get what you need in order to satisfy, for example, your funder. And that's about as far as you want to go. That won't work. So it is about building relationships. It is about inclusion. And you also being open to be invited and included in community kinds of activities. Also, when you're thinking about, it's being honest. When you're thinking about trust, for example, I do evaluation and research. And among the things that I do when I first am entering communities, I'm listening a lot. I also want to be upfront about, it's not only the routine and regular parts of informed consent that you get, signed consent forms and those kinds of things, but it's about the other things that the community members need to know. So, for instance, the Patriot Act. That act permits, when I'm collecting evaluation data or research data, or for any of you actually, permits the U.S. government, for whatever reason, to come in and remove all my data, remove my computers, and also, at the same time, make it illegal for me to tell anybody that that was done. So if I am collecting research and evaluation data, or I have personal data on people, I either find a way to not collect that data and find some other way, in case this were to happen, I have not jeopardized some other people. Also, in that, I informed community members about that, so they can hold back if they need to on certain types of personal information that they would not want getting out into other places. That is received in communities as, I'm bringing to them something new that they may not know about, but I'm informing them about, it's a very remote circumstance that could happen. But I'm letting them know, because I'm working with them as much as possible, that we are, in a sense, equals. And I would treat them the way I would treat my family in that sense. So this trust, this honesty, this openness, and one last thing. You're not the first person to enter these communities. They have been entered for hundreds of years by people that look like you, that came from institutions, that came from universities, that came from funders, that came from the government, that came from whatever. They looked like you, but they didn't come bringing anything that was very helpful. There's a long history experienced by these communities that says when you see somebody that looks like this, it may look like something and you're thinking, well, maybe it's that duck that has been coming in our community for the last 400 years. So you have to also overcome the history that you are actually trying to look at.
Very true, Pauline. And I think a very important point you made was the timeline, is that often when we when we partner with the community for any information, and then we don't go back to them, and they should be the first ones we share any data that we collect with, but there's a rush to get the report written, there's a rush to turn it into the funder, and often the community is left out of any kind of input.
Yes, that's very true. And you want to build their input into as much as possible of the work that you do. Because the examples that I gave were examples where that input was there early and helped influence and improve upon the quality of the research work. And it can be the same thing for programs or projects. You
Absolutely.
want quality work.
Absolutely. We have a question which says, in the breastfeeding field, we often deal with intersecting oppression based on race, gender, socioeconomic status, gender presentation, and educational attainment. From an organizational point of view, can you talk more about how you can, better choose representatives that truly represents the specific community where the work is being done?
I'd say the very first thing to do is ask people.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody asks me something and is sincere and is trying to understand and is not trying to take something from me, but is going to use this information to help provide better quality programs, not only ask me, but include some of the people that you're trying to design programs for. Include them in not just focus groups, but also hire some. Have them help you collect information or data about how to present materials. That way you are also building relationships. You are including the community so they can see it's not something done behind the screen or behind the door, but they can see openly what you are doing, and it gives you many opportunities to explain why you're doing it. That's a whole other level of education and training for the community.
Wonderful. Like you said, when you have a question, the answer is usually within the community, so we just need to ask. Um, and so in closing, we just have a minute left, Pauline. For organizations that are on the call today, the state level coalitions, USBC, our member organizations, who are now, embedding some equity work into their work and trying to open the doors to be able to, create a larger tent. Any from your years of research, any wisdom on how we can, as we build, look at all these different angles, create a more welcoming environment for folks that we are becoming becoming newer partners, but especially on our turf, like when we open the doors and invite them into our turf?
One of the things is you're saying opening the doors and inviting them into your turf. I would say before you do that, create that as an opportunity, but I would encourage people to go out of their turf. You go into those communities, as one of the first things that I said in the presentation. You have no clue. You may think you have because you've been socialized to think you have. You have been socialized to think the world the way you know it operates the same in those communities, and it does not. Nor does it operate the same in other countries and other locales, or even 10 blocks down the street from where you live, if that community is different. So one is developing the intent and actually the practice of exploring other communities and realizing, if you remember the little diagram you're presenting to the audience, you've got to find ways to circle that, but also remember that when you circle that, wherever you go, there you are. So you're taking your culture and all your little biases and all your whatever, we all do that with us. But you have to interact with that audience, have discussion, see what they see. You have to listen. You have to see them as your equal in order to be able to begin to benefit. Just circling through, hey, I drove through, that doesn't do anything.
Very true. Very true. Last question, Pauline, would we be able to find more information on the 5-pathway model, a link or any place that folks are asking if they can read more about it?
It's something that I developed back in 2004, and I presented it in different workshops for the American Evaluation Association and presented it internationally. But I'm presently in the process of writing all of this up. I've got 3 books on racial equity, inequity, racism that I have just sitting on my computer, and I'm ready to get out. So it will eventually come out. But other than that, I mean, if somebody really seriously wanted some more information, they could contact me directly.
And on that note, I do know that Pauline's contact information is here, so feel free to contact Pauline. And again, thank you so much. It was such an honor to have you, Pauline, share this kind of deep research with us as we work in this field, which is so complex and nuanced. And we'd like to have this conversation continue. So please join the Racial Equity Learning community. If you have comments, if you've thought about these questions, post things on the discussion forum so that we might continue beyond this session as well. So thank you again for participating, and until next time, goodbye.
Thank you.